Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time. We seem to have a good quorum of people from around India as well as in Washington and the United States. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Fazio, and I'm the Human Rights Officer here in New Delhi. As you know, the State Department leads the U.S. government's international efforts against human trafficking. Throughout the world, we advocate for government commitment to prosecute traffickers, protect victims, and prevent human trafficking. The global fight is a national priority, and we are at the forefront in our diplomacy. In my short time in India, I've met many compassionate people who are dedicated to protecting the most vulnerable from the heinous crime of human trafficking. I am inspired by your efforts to hold traffickers accountable, protect children, and provide needed services to trafficking survivors. Without your partnership, we could not succeed. So I first want to thank our local partners from Indian law enforcement, government agencies, and civil society who are joining us this evening. We all recognize the importance of working with partners to eliminate human trafficking. No one organization or one country can do it alone. That is why we reached out to a broad spectrum of allies when we created this webinar series. I'm happy tonight to welcome and thank the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery for co-hosting this event. GFEMS is a critical global partner of the State Department to help us achieve sustainable reduction of human trafficking worldwide. During my conversations that I've had with NGO partners and law enforcement officials in India, many identified a lack of relevant data as a barrier to creating appropriate government responses to human trafficking trends. We know that sound policy and budget decisions require accurate data so government interventions can be effective. Tonight's webinar introduces research findings on commercial sexual exploitation in Maharashtra, which will shed light on the size of the industry, demand trends, and the economic hardships faced by its workers. Most importantly, we will hear a number of recommendations that should appeal to stakeholders who focus on trafficking throughout India. It is our hope that tonight's discussion will spur ideas and action in your communities to help eliminate trafficking in persons. I would now like to introduce Alex Thayer, who serves as CEO of GFEMS. Alex has decades of experience addressing the world's most intractable challenges by leading private sector, nonprofit, and government institutions. Alex will begin by introducing a few of his team members, and he'll also explain how GFEMS build partnerships worldwide to galvanize commitments to ending modern slavery. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Alex.
Thanks so much, John. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I want to thank you particularly for your commitment and for the U.S. Embassy for hosting this, and especially to everybody who's showed up today to learn and talk about this important subject. We're also really grateful to the U.S. government for their generous support of GFEMS and the research that we're going to be presenting today. I really want to emphasize something that you said already, which is how important it is to be able to do research like this, to gain understanding of an enormously complex challenge, but also a hidden one. Challenges like the commercial sexual exploitation of children are often hard to understand because we don't see them. And if we don't see them, we can't understand them. And if we can't understand them, we can't ultimately do something about it. And our mission is to work with partners, many of whom you'll hear from today, others who've joined us, and those around the world that are working to end modern slavery and its terrible manifestations like the commercial sexual exploitation of children. There's a really strong and powerful global consensus. Whatever your position is about the legality of sex work, that involvement of minors, children under 18, is a terrible crime, and that it must be stopped. But we also know that it is an enormous problem and that it continues. So we're really pleased to have partners like those you're going to hear from today, research institutions that are doing on the ground research, looking at the granular truth of what is really happening, how it's happening, why it's happening, that will then allow us to support the sorts of policy decisions and programs that will enable us to eliminate this challenge. The three studies that you're going to hear about, I think, are an exciting advance on three important and interrelated questions. First of all, what is the prevalence of commercial sexual exploitation of children in Maharashtra? How big is the problem? Is it? Where does it exist? Second, of course, this terrible pandemic that we're all struggling with has affected so many things, and it has affected this as well. And so we're going to learn about how COVID-19 has in fact affected that landscape. And then finally, what are we starting to learn about how to deter trafficking crimes to prevent the victimization of children in this way? And so I'm going to step out of the way so we can hear the exciting news from what this research has shown us. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Neha Bansal, who is our India country lead.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, John. It's lovely to at least have everybody on this call. I can't say see everybody at this point. In addition to what Alex said, I think it's important to have the evidence on the ground, but it's also equally important that we have this evidence handy. And we saw that especially in the past year, which for many has been one of the most disruptive years. And as policymakers, program implementers, researchers, many of us found ourselves still wanting for more evidence and still not being able to use the evidence that we have at hand. So in addition to this meeting, I want to also just provide a quick window into another initiative that feeds into this, which is earlier this year on the 28th of January, we brought together GFEMS, UN, government, civil society to really ask ourselves, what have we done with the evidence that we already have? And the one thing that came out is that we need many more nimble spaces where we are talking about both researched and not researched, but evidence that we are hearing anecdotally. And also to be able to put in place a hypothetical situation where we are seeing disruptive, situations of disruption, one being COVID, but also several other disruptive situations like that of policy, big policy changes, disasters, and how do we maintain a minimum threshold of response at that time? So what is the minimum threshold of shelter home care that there must be in place? What is the minimum care of legal response that there must be in place? And I hope that that perspective will get discussed, and I'm quite sure of that. But just to kickstart, this meeting, I want to share some of the aspects that came up at this informal roundtable, which is that while this year, the past year, we saw lockdowns, travel bans, trade bans, the world of illicit flows has continued unabated. Unfortunately for us in the sector, it seems from anecdotal information that trafficking has continued through this year, in fact, with a rise. We've had many more women from Bangladesh cross into India than ever before. Mental health issues have seen again an increase. And this has been both sort of accelerated because of the COVID situation, because of several vulnerable populations that felt themselves pushed against the wall and felt themselves completely out of the response system. And that leading to a vicious cycle of future vulnerability to trafficking. So you have people who are mentally, facing mental health issues who are now going to be vulnerable to trafficking in the future as well. The third aspect that came up was gender-based violence, and this having a direct bearing on commercial sexual exploitation with migrants who went back home, believing, unfortunately, and without any sort of substance to this, that the women they had left home were probably engaging in commercial sexual exploitation, or the women who had migrated to other states were migrating for jobs in the commercial sexual industry. So various loose perceptions that came out of the fear that COVID generated. And the fourth bit that I mentioned as I began, which is that it's not just the pandemic that caused disruptions, but big policy changes that cause disruptions in trafficking flows. We saw that during demonetization, but we also saw that during certain policy changes that were put in by the government, one being the lockdown, and several of you experts in the field saw sort of distress marriages happen this year. And the last bit that I want to actually place on the table is that while evidence is important and we keep, asking ourselves for more evidence, I think we need to ask ourselves, what is the kind of evidence that we need at this point? And the areas that came up again are evidence on the demand side and the seasonality of trafficking issues. It's not a regular flow. So I just wanted to place these points as an opening. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mihir. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Neha, for that reality check. Good evening, good morning, everybody, depending on where you are. My name is Mihir Prakash. I'm a senior research manager at GFEMS. First off, on behalf of GFEMS and our partners, I want to welcome and thank you for joining us today to discuss this important issue. I also want to, Alex already did, but I want to thank again the U.S. Embassy for being our gracious hosts and creating a platform for us to share some of our recent research, as well as some key learnings that have emerged from them. I'm excited to be the facilitator for the next 1 hour of this event, where we're going to discuss some of the evidence that's been generated that can support policy and programming decisions to eliminate slavery and exploitative situations in the commercial sex industry and protect minors. So the presenters will give a short overview of their research, and then the idea is to have a longer two-way discussion from which we all emerge a bit more knowledgeable about the issue at hand. For that, we have three excellent team of experts who've been working on different aspects of modern slavery research with GFEMS. These researchers bring years of experience studying various forms of modern slavery using novel research methods to ethically study hard-to-reach populations, and also evaluating what works, what does not work in addressing the root of the problem. There will be three short presentations, and we'll follow that up with an open floor discussion session where I strongly encourage all our participants to engage with our presenters today, ask questions, share your thoughts and experiences. So without further ado, let's move to our first presentation. It comes from 26 Technologies, formerly IST Research. They're a technology firm based in Virginia that enables large-scale communication with hard-to-reach populations around the world. From 26 Technologies, we have Dr. Sam Blazek, who is the Director of Research and Development, as well as Dr. Sarvana Ravindran, who is an applied microeconomist at the National University of Singapore. They'll be discussing their work on estimating the prevalence of child sex trafficking in Maharashtra. So with that, over to you, Sam and Sarvana. Oh, one more quick point for presenters. For technical reasons, John is manning the slide deck, so if you want the slides to change, just let him know. Next slide, please. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. Really excited at this opportunity, and I realize that it's outside typical work hours for both personnel in the US as well as in India. So I really appreciate y'all taking the time. So a quick introduction on the two of us who will be here to discuss today. I'm the chief scientist. Oh, I updated my own slides, but you know what? I didn't update these slides. IST was merged with another company just earlier this week, end of last week. So we're still getting used to the new name. So I may just say IST Research for now. But we're here to talk about a mixed method study that we performed in 2020 to estimate the prevalence of child sex trafficking in Maharashtra. This was sponsored by GFEMS. As Mihir mentioned, I'm Chief Scientist and Director of R&D at IST Research. My research areas are broadly machine learning applications to human security problems in almost any form. Statistical prevalence methods particularly as they apply to hidden populations and survey methods in general. Saravana, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm an assistant professor in economics and public policy at the Public Policy School at the National University of Singapore. I was at the University of California, Los Angeles, not too long ago and just moved, and that's sort of how I got into this work with Sam. My research interests are broad. I study a variety of topics in the economics of developing countries. As sort of pertinent to this presentation, I study issues in gender-based violence, violence against women in India, and we're very excited to talk about this work.
Great. I think we can advance to the next slide. So a quick sort of primer on IST research and our work with GFEMS in India. So we are researching and seeking to support stakeholders combating human trafficking across several domains. We're here today to discuss child sex trafficking. We also are working on a large-scale project that addresses domestic migrant forced labor in the construction industry. We're using several different methods to perform these studies. Broadly, they have to do with using engagement technology and capabilities, which at IST take the form of a platform called Pulse, to speak with very large numbers of people or to rigorously make contact with and survey a general population or a hidden population of an area across different platforms and modalities. Some of the outcomes include generating accurate prevalence estimates and rapid prevalence estimates of forced labor and child sex trafficking, tracking large numbers of folks who are migrating across national borders and within countries to identify the prevalence of forced labor and the indicators or sort of risks that lead to higher prevalence of forced labor, and to work with GFEMS and their partner organizations to better understand deterrence efforts and intervention efforts and how they're effectively helping to combat modern slavery. I think we can move to the next slide. Okay, so now to really focus in on this study in particular. As I mentioned in the intro, this was a mixed methods or multiple method study. Oh, I think I lost the video. There we go. A multiple method study to estimate the prevalence of child sex trafficking in Maharashtra. The reason why we opted for a multi-method study is that each method is prone to different types of biases here when you're trying to measure the size of the hidden population. It's a difficult task to do. And so we tried to use multiple methods to account for those biases and also to try and just get a better snapshot of what both the commercial sex industry as well as child sex trafficking look like on the ground through our surveys. And to some extent, although our study predated COVID in its design, to get some information about the effects that the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns have had on the commercial sex industry as well. So we use two different methods here. The first is respondent-driven sampling. With respondent-driven sampling, you begin with a seed group, which is a small number of people who are actually within the hidden population, and you essentially reward those respondents for referring your survey to other people who are also within the hidden population, thereby growing your sample size. Over time, this sample becomes quite large. It can grow exponentially. And at the end of it, you can then essentially determine the prevalence of some condition within your sample. In this case, it's a bit of a modified design of RDS because you cannot directly survey minors, for one, but also if you are surveying people who are experiencing at the time a serious crime such as child sex trafficking, you have to report that to the authorities. So we naturally can't survey CST victims directly. So instead, what we did was we ran RDS over the adult sex worker population in Maharashtra. There's some risks with RDS. It's arguable whether or not this leads to an actually good sample of respondents from within a population, whether it's really representative of that population. So to try and mitigate those risks, we didn't just start with the first 10 or 20 sex workers who we could find to basically begin the survey as seeds. Instead, we used time location sampling to select a good representative group of seeds, which ensured that the study already kind of began with a probability sample. The second method we used was the network scale-up method. This is a method that surveys the general population of a geographic region and asks them a series of questions, which is also often called the game of contacts. Those questions take the form of, how many people do you know who are X, where X might be doctors or lawyers, taxi drivers, you go down the list. And then you start asking, how many people do you know who are, for example, sex workers? Of the sex workers you know, how many are under age 18? How many are under age 15? And so on. The reason why you ask all of those initial questions is because you know the sizes of those populations. And so you're able to quantitatively map personal network sizes to actual population values for the geographic region. So we use census data on a number of different reference groups in Maharashtra to essentially calibrate a model that then enabled us to estimate the size of the hidden groups of people. And that's broadly speaking how the network scale-up method works. On the right side there, you can see a graphic which shows estimates in blue compared to known population numbers in black. That was from a pilot project that we ran in Vietnam back in 2018. But we used both methods for this study. In addition, on the NSUM side, we also asked the respondents about people they knew who had paid for sex in the past year. And so we tried to get a little bit better understanding of the demand side as well. Okay, next slide. I'm grateful for the scroll. It helps me find time to drink a little water. So overview of our results here. So what we found, and I will identify the methods for each finding here. In early 2020, there were approximately 29,000 sex workers in Maharashtra. Of those, approximately 8,000 were CST victims, so that's slightly less than 30% of the total. That was determined using the NSUM estimates. Our RDS surveys of adult sex workers indicated that approximately 31% of them entered the industry while underage. We also estimated and examined the demand, as I mentioned, finding that of those who resided locally in Maharashtra and had purchased sex recently, approximately 3,200 or 36% who paid for sex with an individual under the age of 18 arranged the transaction digitally. This speaks to one of our findings that was consistent across all of the methods, which is that there seems to be a divide in network structure between essentially venue-based sex work and digitally organized sex work. And there also seems to be a bit of a disconnect between adult sex workers and CST victims. So those connections, or rather the lack of those connections, seems to be evident in our numeric findings and in some of the other survey data that we collected in this study. We also asked sex workers, the adult sex workers in the RDS component, about the impact of COVID-19 on the industry. The high-level summary here is the industry has shrunk, but not much. I would actually maybe change that now upon reflection to say the industry appears to have shrunk, but not by much. Of those who were surveyed, 5% knew an individual who entered the industry as a result of the pandemic, and one of those was underage, was a minor. Of those surveyed, 41% knew an individual who exited the industry as a result of the pandemic, one of whom was underage. And the last bullet, which I'm not sure is fully visible, but just kind of speaks to this broader point, is that the dynamics of the industry may be changing to adapt to economic, technological, and other shifts caused or accelerated by COVID-19. I tend to think that these are things that are really accelerated by the pandemic, primarily the turn to digital sex work, including digital sexual exploitation, as well as digital organization of things that individuals in the past or people who participate in commercial in this sex in the past would have just done in person previously. So that's what I have. That's what we have to present for the time being, and we'll be open to discussion after this, after the rest of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Sarvana. Really interesting presentation. I personally find it fascinating that using social media platforms and tools for prevalence estimation, and how technology is helping lower barriers that traditional research methods have had for a long time, and more importantly, how methods can be combined to get more accurate results, statistics. I think we have a couple more minutes, so maybe I can ask a question from my side. I'm curious to know more about some of the biases that are associated with the research methods you adopted, and more importantly, you mentioned you estimated around 29,000 sex workers currently active in Maharashtra, and 30% of them being CST victims. What do those biases do in terms of these numbers being an overestimation or an underestimation? Is the scope of the problem bigger or smaller?
So that's a really good question. It is an ongoing topic certainly in the prevalence estimation methodology literature. But broadly speaking, there are a few key biases when you're using the network scale-up method. The first is barrier effects, which is essentially it's demographically driven lack of network connections. So people are not uniformly randomly connected to one another. If you are an elderly farmer, the probability of you knowing a larger number of, let's say, primarily urban-based sex workers is going to be very low, as opposed to someone who might live closer to where the commercial sex industry is highly active. There's also transmission error, which is reflected in a few different ways. Social desirability bias, so essentially feeling like you don't want to admit something because it will be embarrassing to you or stigmatized, as well as perhaps just not being fully aware of someone's status. So I believe in particular our estimate of the demand side may suffer from transmission error because people are not necessarily going to tell their friends that they are engaged in the commercial sex industry. On the other hand, it may be more apparent when someone is a sex worker. So that's something that I believe is generally better understood, or that people are more aware of. I would say that in general, INSOM seeks to minimize those sorts of social desirability biases by not asking people directly about themselves, but by asking them about people who they know. And it also does not ask them to identify those people, which gives them a sense of security and a sense of sort of anonymity and safety in discussing their peers freely.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sam. Moving on to our second presentation. It's from Dahlberg. It's a consulting firm that works on sustainable development issues. We have with us Kanishka Bhattacharya, who is an associate partner with Dahlberg based in Mumbai. His work involves advisory services to private and public sector partners in strategy planning and management, market analysis, and monitoring and evaluation. Unfortunately, your colleague Sweta could not make it, but I'm sure one person is plenty to share your work. He'll be sharing their work on a two-part study to measure and track deterrence among CSEC actors in Maharashtra. Over to you, Kanishka.
Thank you very much, Mihir, and thank you to the U.S. Embassy and GFEMS for this opportunity to speak in front of this audience, and thank you everybody for listening in. As Mihir said, my name is Kanishka, and I'm an associate partner with Dahlberg's Bombay office. My co-director for the project, Sweta, who's also one of the firm's gender leads, is unfortunately not with us today. And I will do my best to fill her shoes in her absence. I am here to talk to you over the next 10 minutes about our study to measure deterrence of CSEC in Maharashtra. I'll be taking you through the background and findings, some early findings of our study, and also dwell on a few early recommendations. Next slide, please. Let me start by motivating why it was important to look into deterrence in the first place. First of all, as we've just heard from the previous presentation, there's an urgent need, and whatever we've heard is also tells us that it is a growing need. And with estimates from Dalberg analysis as well as other organizations, kind of putting the number nationally at 300,000 to 600,000, which is more than anywhere else in the world. Secondly, is this idea that deterrence can be a strong tool to prevent CSEC, and one that is somewhat understudied and understudied today. So currently, our best study and our understanding indicates that traffickers and customers in India consider CSEC to be a relatively low-risk way to either make profits or derive sexual gratification, despite the fact that trafficking of minors is a clear crime, as well as the purchase of sex from minors is also illegal. So the idea here is that there are certain perceptions that are currently in the minds of traffickers as well as customers that basically put it so that they perceive the benefits of these illicit activities to be higher than the costs. And so the idea with deterrence, which is the sort of core thesis of our study, is that you want to be able to change the fundamental risk-reward assessment that's going on in the part of criminals and potential criminals, so that the perceived costs of CSEC are much higher than the perceived benefits. And this, in turn, will result in lower prevalence of the crime. So this is the idea that sort of started it. Next slide, please. And building on this idea, GFEMS commissioned, as Mihir pointed to, a two-part study to measure and track deterrence among CSEC stakeholders in Maharashtra. There were 4 research questions. One was, first, let's look and define the concept of criminal deterrence within the context of CSEC. To do this, obviously, we banked on and built off a lot of existing research in general criminal theory as well as research into sex trafficking, but really tried to contextualize that for the context of CSEC. And then once we had that overarching frame, which we'll dive into in a second, the other main questions were, how to what extent do we see the necessary external conditions in place to serve as a basis for deterrence in Maharashtra? To what extent are criminals and potential criminals aware of these external conditions, and what are their perceptions of these conditions? And to what extent have these conditions actually deterred criminals, and what is early emerging evidence for that link from deterrence to prevalence? So the idea was to basically test all of these out. The study has been operationalized in areas of intervention where 2 prominent anti-trafficking organizations have been administering rule of law activities. And there's also additional research that happened in one area where there was no overarching sort of strong NGO or anti-trafficking organization presence. The baseline study was conducted in 2019, so some of what you're going to be hearing is obviously happened a long time ago. And so some of that COVID perspective, which is obviously important, is going to be missing from here. But that is something that we think we will be coming back to in 2022 when we do the end line. Next slide, please. So really quickly, what did we do? We basically created a framework, which I'll just go through. We developed a set of tools and questionnaires that we hope will be valuable for GFEMS as well as other actors beyond just the purview of this project. The instruments were targeted at various different actors in the CSEC chain. And so we hope that that can serve as a baseline or a starting point for other research into the area, which is certainly much needed. And we conducted the baseline, which now I will go through. Next slide, please. So let me talk a little bit about the actual framework that we developed in conjunction with our colleagues at GFEMS, and just building off, as I said, existing research as well as conversations with experts. And fundamentally, this is a very acknowledged linear representation of something which is clearly not linear and quite complex. And we went into this very purposefully looking for something that would simplify. And so what we came up with this framework, which if you read from left to right, essentially works on the logic that deterrence can be driven by influencing the prevailing external conditions, namely economic, legal, social, and technological, as well as the criminal's perceptions of the effectiveness of these conditions. So I think important to highlight here is that we're kind of viewing deterrence as an outcome, so that CSEC can be prevented because an offender or a potential offender perceives the costs of committing the crime to exceed the perceived benefits, going back to something that I had said earlier. And so there is a very strong behavioral aspect to it. And I think that was the fundamental point in this framework, is that you need to have external conditions in a certain way. And that obviously contributes to certain perceptions, but you can also target and tackle perceptions directly, and so that, as I said, the perceived costs of actually the crime are much higher than the benefits. Next slide, please. So with this framework in mind, we went ahead and did a bunch of research, and if there's interest in sort of the methodologies, then I can get into that in the Q&A. But let me just maybe quickly talk through the key findings and some emerging recommendations. So in terms of the key findings, number one, long-standing and harmful misconceptions of CSEC victims continue. And kind of come in the way of effective law enforcement, even when the intent is there. So more than half of the police officers across Maharashtra during our study believed that victims of CSEC were in the trade by choice. And so that was surprising. And so there's something there about changing some of those underlying perceptions. Nevertheless, important to note that there have been signs of improvement in the landscape as well as legal processes and outcomes. For example, the study showed that about 88% of law enforcement officers surveyed rated their own awareness of CSEC to be high and growing. More than half of the officers were able to identify POCSO, ITPA, and IPC laws, which is the three sort of major pillars of the anti-CSEC framework in India, and could correctly sort of apply or could correctly apply those to traffickers and customers in CSEC cases. On the customer side, we learned that social perceptions and the fear of social repercussions and sanction at a community level were very strong drivers and of concern. So 53% of the potential customers we surveyed rated social risk as the most important deterrent in terms of persuading them or convincing them against taking the act of committing CSEC. They're also worried about the fear of isolation, of being shamed and rejected by family and friends. So that's a sort of an important thing that came through as something that could contribute strongly to deterrence. On the trafficker side, slightly pessimistically, while traffickers are quite aware of the existing laws against CSEC, but the perception of actually the risk of getting caught or being convicted for their crimes is quite low. So about 9 out of the 10 traffickers that we interviewed, and these are all ex-traffickers, said that they were, when they were in the process of doing their crimes, that they were ultimately, even if they were caught for their crimes, they were fairly certain that it would not lead to long-term conviction. And this is kind of backed up by the data, which shows that it takes anywhere between 1 to 3 years for a case to get to a decision in court. again, more on the positive side, where law enforcement has become stricter, customers and traffickers notice. So, for example, potential customers surveyed in intervention areas in Mumbai and Nagpur were compared to the non-intervention areas in Pune, noted an increased risk in the form of the fear of getting caught by the police due to stricter law enforcement. So visibly showing signs of enforcement actually sends a strong signal to potential criminals and criminals. And then finally, I think, perhaps somewhat expectedly, the data on deterrence at this stage is mixed. We hope that, with the Endline study in 2022, some of these findings will get stronger. But at this stage, some data that's coming about as many police officers surveyed, approximately a third, believe that CSEC is increasing as those that held the opposing view. So, obviously these are reported numbers or perceptions of numbers, so not actually, prevalence, as the previous presentation was pointing to, but still, I think a good marker in terms of, what's actually happening. And then finally, on the last slide, I'll just touch upon some emerging recommendations. This slide here, these recommendations are already a bit select from a wider range of recommendations that we've put in front of GFEMS. And maybe I'll just talk through one each as far as traffickers and customers are concerned. So for traffickers, let me dwell on the suggestion or recommendation on offering improved witness protection and economic protection for whistleblowers. And this is basically, this would be a long-term play, but we think it could be fairly game-changing. Because the current CSEC model makes it almost impossible to identify and prosecute kingpins, in particular, the people who are at the top of the totem pole. And the model also makes it challenging to prosecute even lower level traffickers because of the protection that kingpins offer. And so this power dynamic really needs to be broken. And providing the opportunity to safely provide information to law enforcement officials from community members, especially because these traffickers are often deeply embedded within the community, either at the source or the destination side, is one way of, I think, really sort of enhancing the ability of the public justice system to engage the community in these efforts, which is very much needed. And then on the customer side, building on the same theme of community engagement, our data pointed to an interesting gap. So as I referred to before, customers fear social and community repercussions and sanction the most. But the surveys also suggested that the awareness levels in the broader community and the general population about CSEC is quite low. And attitudes are not necessarily favorable towards victims. And so this kind of points to that gap, right? And empowering the general population could really help, creating awareness about CSEC, its prevalence, how to identify potential victims and criminals, thinking about, police engaging more with community groups to actually to run joint initiatives is another idea that is worth considering. So let me pause there and hand it back to Mihir. That's mostly all I had.
Perfect. Thank you, Kanishka. I think I really like the fact that your research is focusing on the perception side of things, which is really important in trying to truly understand what the root cause of the problem is and how to address it. And it's definitely complementary insights to the prevalence estimates, which provides to an idea of the scale of the problem. Our third and last presentation is by Nork at the University of Chicago, who conducted a rapid assessment of the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on CSE in Maharashtra between March and September of last year. So very relevant still. From Nork, we have Kareem Kisia, who is a program area director leading Nork's work on vulnerable populations research. And we also have Erica Keaveney, who is a senior research scientist supporting the international department's portfolio on labor and trafficking research. So with that, over to you, Nork team.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, let's get started. So as Mihir mentioned, I'm Erica Kevany, a senior research scientist with NORC at the University of Chicago. And this rapid assessment was conducted in the latter half of last year. The overall purpose is to understand how COVID was affecting and is affecting the commercial sexual exploitation of children and adults and the commercial sex industry in India writ large. We did focus on Maharashtra, but of course, some of our findings are broader than that. The study was structured around 6 research questions designed to address COVID's short and long-term impact on India's sex industry. And well, the purpose of the study is to understand the relationship between COVID and commercial sexual exploitation, especially of children. We did focus on the commercial sex industry more broadly because this allows for better understanding of the typical environments within which exploitation occurs. So we looked at how government response and social protections have affected those in the commercial sex industry during COVID. And we also explored changes in the mechanisms for buying and selling sex, as well as changes in supply and demand patterns. Next slide. This is a mixed method study. On the qualitative side, we conducted a systematic desk review of over 80 media sources, including news articles, white papers, blogs, and so forth. We also conducted key informant interviews with 20 participants from 13 different NGOs working in the C-sex space, some of which I imagine are here on this call. On the quantitative side, we partnered with IST Research to do 2 activities. The first is a web survey of male adult self-professed buyers of sex in Maharashtra. And the second is automated web scraping of 11 popular websites used to discuss or advertise sex work in Maharashtra. So this web scraping activity was automated using IST's technology. Next slide. So I'm just going to jump right into our key findings. This is not exhaustive. There's more to this, and I would strongly encourage anyone who's interested to go to our website and check out our report as well as the policy brief. But I will just go into some of the key things that emerged from the study. So the first is that the demand for in-person sex has dropped while demand for virtual sex has grown. However, these trends are likely temporary. So findings from multiple sources all suggest that face-to-face engagement has declined substantially, and this is due to a decrease in demand and pandemic-related movement restrictions. Next slide. So here we have a graph. This shows web scrapes of popular online forums about sex work. And we could see here just the difference between the gray and the blue. We have pretty precipitous drop in Maharashtra-related postings following India's lockdown in March 2020. So since 2017, these 2 sites, International Sex Guide and Massage Planet, had typically seen between 2,000 and 3,500 posts per month. But in April 2020, the number of posts dropped to 790. And this represents a 4-year low for these websites. Similarly, the web survey with adult male buyers of sex indicate that sexual encounters in person declined post-COVID. So in the 6 months before COVID, it was on average 6 encounters per month, or sorry, 5 encounters total over that pre-COVID 6-month period. And then in the 6 months following COVID, it dropped to 3 encounters. So there's multiple sources indicating a general drop in demand. Next slide. At the same time, virtual sex is growing in popularity. And by virtual sex, we're referring to live phone sex and live video streams. Next slide. So here we have more of the web scraping data, but here we're looking specifically at posts that included keywords that would indicate that they're related to video. So the key terms include video and cam. And you can see here that immediately after COVID, there was a spike in the number of video-related posts, and this represented an all-time high for these websites at the time. I think it's a 42% increase from the previous 2-month period. But you can also see that as we kind of move on toward, move forward in time, that the video-related posts are starting to kind of drop back down and revert to pre-COVID levels. Next slide. So it appears that this virtual sex is unlikely to displace in-person physical sex over the longer term. This is owing to client preferences and the fact that commercial sex workers are not able to command the same price point as in-person work. And of course, there is a general lack of access to smartphones and the technical know-how to make a switch over to purely virtual sex work. And so multiple stakeholders, as well as this analysis of web scraping data, all seem to suggest that the trends in demand for in-person and virtual sex are going to return to pre-pandemic levels after pandemic has ended, which will hopefully be soon. Next slide, please. However, critically, and this is consistent with what Sam presented, the channels through which people buy and sell in-person sex may be permanently changing, and COVID has likely accelerated these changes. So while the spikes in virtual sex are temporary, web and app-based mechanisms for arranging sexual in-person encounters are changing, and that includes mechanisms for recruitment, for solicitation, and payments. And these are likely to continue to trend upward, with COVID having accelerated these trends. Also critically, the pandemic appears to have accelerated a shift away from red light areas to more private, decentralized locations and venues. So many people are aware that red light areas had been kind of dubbed a hotbed for COVID and the spread of COVID. And there was a very controversial study released by some professors from Yale that suggested that, you know, the number of deaths, COVID-related deaths in India could drop dramatically if red light areas were shut down. So this presumed status as hotbeds for COVID shifted face-to-face engagements away from red light areas to more private residences, hotels, and massage parlors. And so while demand for in-person sex will eventually return to pre-COVID levels, the focus point for these face-to-face engagements is likely to remain diffuse and therefore less visible than before the pandemic. So some stakeholders, and one is quoted here, believe that this really marks the beginning of a long-term shift away from red light areas to more private, decentralized settings. And this is going to make commercial sexual exploitation more difficult to identify, investigate, and shut down. Next slide. On to the next key finding. This will not be a surprise to anyone, but vulnerability to CSEC, commercial sexual exploitation of children, has increased dramatically since the pandemic started, and it's likely to continue long after it ends. And this is especially true because a lot of people have had to take out debt to weather the economic downturn, and they're going to be paying the price of that for some time into the future, even after the pandemic. The children most vulnerable to CSEC are those in extreme poverty, children of sex workers, religious minorities, members of scheduled caste tribes and other backwards classes, Bangladeshis, and critically, residents of the areas in West Bengal that were hit by the cyclone late last year. CSEC survivors that previously exited the sex trade are also highly vulnerable to re-victimization. And then finally, vulnerability to child marriage and trafficking for child labor have also increased. Next slide. So vulnerability to online sexual exploitation of children, or OSEC, has also increased, but with some important caveats. So the first is that the children children that are online are the ones that are most vulnerable to OSEC and online grooming. But of course, around half of Indians still lack access to the internet. And so this demographic may look very different from the demographic that's vulnerable to CSEC in its more traditional or analog forms. And then while OSEC demand has increased since the start of the pandemic, this is presumed by many to be in demand for child sexual abuse material, or CSAM, intended for mass consumption rather than live sex acts involving children. So this is important because while OSEC demand has increased, this does not necessarily translate into growth in the actual supply, because of course there's not a one-to-one relationship between victim and perpetrator when it comes to CSAM intended for mass consumption. Next slide. The next finding: when demand for in-person commercial sex returns to normal, things could get a lot worse for CSEC victims. So more people than ever are at risk of falling into the sex trade, but of course, with low demand, there's not a lot happening there. However, when demand returns, the price point is likely to start lower. So this supply-demand gap is basically leading to a deflation in the price of sex. Even during COVID, there are reports of sex workers taking as little as 70 cents for a sexual encounter in order to get their clients back. So with this supply-demand gap and price deflation, we're looking at poor living conditions and heightened abuse of victims. And stakeholders, some argue that this could lead to a whole new range of sexual services and increased abuse of CSEC victims. Next slide. So on to recommendations. The first recommendation is to ensure that advocacy, prevention, and victim outreach activities are aligned to the new normal. So I think the most critical thing to come out of this is the shift toward virtual brokering and also private decentralized venues rather than centralized red light areas. And this is going to require new and creative thinking from law enforcement and service providers on how to reach victims. So one way to do this could be by sponsoring web-based advertisements and public service announcements, targeting both buyers and sellers of sexual services on common brokering platforms. These PSAs could focus on CSEC laws and penalties for buyers, channels for reporting CSEC to law enforcement, and emergency services for victims and survivors. Of course, not everyone is online. So there could also be an opportunity to use the web scraping methodology similar to what was done with IST to extract phone numbers from these websites for SMS campaigns so that those without internet can still be reached. Next slide. The next recommendation is to push to strengthen and enforce laws and accountability measures related to cybercrimes. So India lacks a good system for identifying and intervening in web and app-based illicit transactions. So there's a need for strengthening cyber laws in India, including holding site owners, web hosts, and ISPs accountable for activities occurring through their platforms. Next slide. The next recommendation is to focus prevention and vulnerability reduction activities at the source. This, again, some areas in particular, West Bengal, the vulnerability is going to increase over the longer term because of these bets people have taken on. Some approaches for reducing vulnerability at the source might include programs tailored to the realities of these populations. Something as simple as just making sure that campaigns are in the right language. Information campaigns through radio, print, and other media channels. And then one NGO key informant recommended studying inflows and outflows of migrants in source communities. Next slide. The next recommendation is to rethink alternative livelihood programming. So the livelihood programs have been hard hit by the economic downturn, as with many sectors, and the job prospects are very meager. So for example, there's anecdotes of CSE survivors that were in a hospitality training program, but of course, with hotels and restaurants closed down, there are no job opportunities for them. And similarly, those receiving training for clerical occupations are facing a lot of company hiring freezes. So this underscores a need for a change in short-term thinking about alternative livelihood. But even pre-pandemic, our desk review showed that a lot of women who sold sex also had already worked as domestic workers, construction workers, and daily wage earners, and almost 30% of women continue to work in these other jobs after taking up sex work. One informant reported that many commercial sex workers are having to exit the industry and return to low-paying domestic jobs because of a lack of customers willing to meet their going rates. And in fact, there's one anecdote of someone who now earns in 1 month what they used to earn in 1 hour. So it's important that these livelihood programs that they think beyond these kind of low-level occupations that offer poverty wages, because many people in the sex industry are already in these occupations, and thus it may not suffice in keeping them out of the sex trade. Some stakeholders advocate for going beyond vocational training and focusing more on entrepreneurship by supporting access to financing, markets, and marketing support. Next slide. The next recommendation is to adapt, but take care to avoid exchanging what works for novelty. So even though we've seen some changes and trends on how things are going online, the majority of CSEC is still occurring offline, and that's going to be true well into the future. And the demographic most vulnerable to CSEC is still offline. It's thus important that any OSEC-related interventions not come at the cost of CSEC, analog CSEC interventions at large. And also a shift to digital victim services. Some service providers have seen success with this, but it can be very challenging. A training program, for example, that's training girls to become seamstresses can't necessarily do that over the web or phone because they need access to equipment. And it's especially true for children. There have been attempts to switch to virtual courtrooms, but this has been, in the courts in India, this has been difficult for child cases since children often rely on gesture to explain the abuse. So it can be difficult to have that over a virtual platform. And then again, the training programs have met with limited success. And then, of course, there's also remote psychosocial support, which can work in some cases, but can be very difficult for children because they may depend more on therapeutic approaches that involve play or arts-based therapy. Next slide. Oh, well, that is the end. So thank you. And I also want to thank my colleague, Corinne Pessier, who's on this call and was really deeply involved in this research. And of course, thanks to IST.
Thanks, Erica, for that wonderful presentation on getting a pulse on what is going on during these unprecedented times and how we should adapt our response. In the interest of time, let's jump straight into the Q&A open floor part of this webinar. A few kind of ground rules. If you have a question for some of our presenters or some comments that you'd like to share, please type it in chat or raise your hand to get the floor. And then if you could introduce yourself and your organization in 2 sentences before you pose your question or your comment, that would be fantastic. Thank you. The floor is open now.
Just one clarification. If you could raise your hand using the WebEx system has a button, looks like a little hand, and then I could unmute you so you can introduce yourself and ask the question verbally to the panel.
And we have Sean Soki with their hand raised.
Okay.
Thank you,
Hi, Sean,
John.
how are you?
I'm doing well, John. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mihir, and thank you for the panelists and the presentations. My name is Sean Soki, and I'm the director for programs with Justice Ventures International. We are an anti-human trafficking organization, and some of my colleagues are on this call. I had a question. We are also a TIP partner, so that's why we are happy to be invited to this event. I have a question for the Dahlberg Group. In one of your deterrence models, I wonder if you came across any information from your respondents on how effective was the arrest of customers, customers who engaged with sex with minors or during brothel rescues. How effective was that as a deterrent? Because we have seen in our experience in Bihar, where we have consciously worked with the police to arrest customers during a brothel raid or rescue intervention. And we have found this to be a success, and also using this as a tool in the social media space to highlight this. So I just wanted to know whether this was a finding in your research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. Mihir, is it all right if I just go ahead and answer it directly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much, Sean. I think super important point, and actually one of the recommendations that we had on the customer side was to really focus on the ability of law enforcement and capacity of law enforcement to arrest customers and prosecute customers for engaging in CSEC. Of course, the law is on the books, but what we heard through our surveys and anecdotally, that oftentimes, depending on the situation, there is often an inclination on the part of public justice system and police to not actually go after customers, and they have varying reasons for it, including perfectly justifiable ones in terms of you really want to go after the traffickers and so on. But we did pick up from our survey of customers as well as potential customers. So we were kind of sampling from a high potential groups like construction workers, college students in certain areas, and they did mention that the fear of arrest was an important one, but the problem was that they also had the perception that they would not actually be arrested. Even if they were taken into custody, it's usually something that they would then get released. So I think that the point that you make and what you're saying, that's the data that's coming out of Bihar is certainly supported by some of the evidence that we've been hearing.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Dahlberg. I believe Sudha has a question. She put one in the chat. I'll unmute you here so you can ask it of the group.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question about the prevalence of online sex trafficking. We know that the business of prostitution moved online, but what about the trafficking itself moving online? So I'm Sudha from My Choices Foundation. We are also one of the TIP partners for GFEMS. So I'm also a research scholar studying the trafficking trends in India from TIS, Tata Institute of Social Sciences. So I'm interested to know about the prevalence of trafficking happening online.
Thank you, Sudha. Sam, would you like to take that one?
Sure. So in our prevalence estimate studies, what we gathered are essentially snapshots in time. So I can't speak to changes over time. Our estimates were a baseline, and we anticipate also conducting inline estimates and then comparing the two. What I can say is that as mentioned in the findings slide, we did see that of those who had paid for a sexual encounter locally, 36% arranged them. 36% of those who paid for sex with an individual under age 18 arranged those online. I think maybe the NORC team might have a better grasp of the sort of change and what the future looks like there. So I might turn over to them for maybe a little bit better information.
Yeah, I mean, I should start by saying that we didn't study prevalence, so it was not a part of our study, but I can kind of speak to the question, just kind of using our research taken together, and especially research from the qualitative side. And I do think that like the online prevalence, I mean, it's important to define that a little bit more, because there's online sexual exploitation, or OSEC, and that can include live sex acts that are streamed over the internet or over the phone. It can also include child sexual abuse material or child pornography. But I think that what we really did see is that there's that the pandemic has sort of accelerated the shift toward using the internet and web-based apps, including like WhatsApp and so forth, to arrange transactions. They're also using online platforms to pay for in-person transactions, and so there's definitely, we are seeing a trend on that front. But I can't say that we have any evidence on the actual prevalence of online sex trafficking that's occurring, but just that the mechanisms for recruiting, soliciting, and paying for sex using the internet are going up dramatically.
I can add maybe one additional comment, which is that in our RDS study, when we spoke with the adult sex workers, not that many of them admitted to knowing a minor in the industry. There are, two potential explanations for that. The first is that they were afraid to do so because it would potentially open them up to a lot of legal and criminal risk. The second, which I think is backed up by some of the data from the NORC study and some of ours, is that these networks are increasingly, maybe not increasingly, but they're somewhat distinct from one another. And there's this third sort of moderating influence, which is the digitization of coordinating sexual activity in the commercial sex industry. So it's possible that essentially these traditional kind of brothel-based, venues are not really connected to a growing industry of commercial sex, including sexual exploitation, that's primarily digitally arranged. And that is certainly growing. Whether it's growing as the sort of venue-based sex industry is shrinking, or whether it's growing independently from that, I don't know that we have enough data to say quite yet.
Thank you, Sam. I see Mamta has a question. Mamta, would you like? Please go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mamta. I'm from Ethics Free India Suraksha, and we are also a TIP partner. First of all, congratulations for these three wonderful presentations, great insight. I have two questions actually. One is to the Dalbo group, because we are engaged in police training, and in this project, I see that you have made a very good observation in terms of sensitivity, of lack of sensitivity of law enforcement agencies, especially in terms of knowing victims. I was just wondering if you could, kind of expand it a bit in terms of what exactly would you like to highlight in terms of knowing the victims. And my second question to Noak, I think wonderful presentation, and I have two questions. One, I wanted to understand in terms of the demand for online sexual exploitation, or demand for online sexual exploitation of children, whether you have been able to look at urban-rural divide, where is most of these demand coming from, and where are the responses coming from? And second, I had this question on, which is a very interesting one, where you have talked about that there is a demand for child sexual abuse material intended for mass consumption. I was wondering where this demand is from. If you could expand a bit on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mamta. Perhaps Kanishka, you can take the first one about what would knowing the victim mean on the police side, and then I think the second two, the urban-rural, where's the demand coming from, and the one after that, I think, is more for the online material consumption. Perhaps Nork could talk to those two.
Sure. Thanks,
Start
Nick.
with you, Kanishka. Yeah.
Sounds good, and I'll try to keep it short. So I think, again, really good question. What was coming out of particularly, I think, not just the quantitative survey, but really when we're kind of talking about some of the anecdotal conversations that we were having as well with justice system actors. What was coming out is that the fact that that police officers believe victims, particularly victims of CSEC, willingly engage in commercial sex and the commercial sex industry, leads to them having perceptions that there's no real point in rehabilitating them into the mainstream society. And this actually makes them less inclined to kind of fight the crime in the first place. And some of this is, I think, is changing because of the regulation and the institutionalization of the ATHUs, and specialized training and specialized operatives, inclusion of more women police officers into these aspects. So some of this is changing, and so should definitely acknowledge that. But in terms of what should happen, we feel that really thinking about sensitization modules, which are perhaps integrated into existing interventions with organizations that are actually NGOs and CBOs that are actually working with police to give them existing training on things like caseloads and case management. That sort of qualitative sensitization training, which actually helps build a better understanding of, who are the victims, where are they coming from, why are they entering into this, how are traffickers actually deeply embedded into this. Some of the more social elements of it will really help with this idea of empathy. And it's difficult to talk about empathy in a very sort of quantitative way, but we certainly felt that essentially right now a lot of the training is very efficiency focused. So it's about how do you make the system work better and become more efficient. Whereas I think we feel that coming out of these interviews, that if you actually make it more about building that empathy and that relationship with the victim, you might actually achieve higher levels of efficiency. So hopefully that gives you a few thoughts in terms of the question that you asked.
Thanks, Kanishka. Erica, do you want to take the other two?
Sure. So the first question on the urban-rural divide and where the demand is coming from, I can't say that we actually have data on that. Our web survey and web scraping was targeting Maharashtra. So for the web scraping, it was focused on Maharashtra related postings, and then the web survey was only targeting people in Maharashtra. But I can't say that within Maharashtra that we have the ability to sort of disaggregate any of the findings. On the question about child sexual abuse material and where the demand is coming from, this is really this kind of finding is coming from our desk review, and there are several studies on this, which I'd be happy to share, and are also referenced in our broader report. But I think the most notable is a study that was released by India Child Protection Fund, ICPF, which noted a dramatic spike in demand for online pornography in India. And this, I think it's a very, very interesting study that used web data and I think data from Pornhub and so forth, which I'd be happy to share after this call.
Thanks, Erica. I think we have another question from Kriti Awasthi. John.
Yes. Good evening, Kriti. Please go ahead.
Hi everyone. Hi, John. This is Kriti Awasthi. I'm an advocate who works with Justice Ventures International. My question was actually based on, in the various studies that have been conducted, what are the rehabilitative measures for women and these minor girls who've been rescued? In your experience, what are the rehabilitative measures that have been taken? What industry have they been rehabilitated into? Have we been able to provide anybody with what are the various means and industries that they can join from where they can earn their own money? Because that's the first reason why they got into this industry. And is there a list of NGOs that you have gathered who specifically work in that area?
That's an interesting question. I will ask my NORC colleagues if they have a quick response for that.
Sure.
But just to clarify, I think this. Sorry, I'll let you go ahead first, Kareem, and then maybe I can add a few sentences.
I was just going to say that I think that there's not enough research into this area, and that it's one of the most, important areas that needs research. Is survivors who receive services and programming, what are the short, medium, and long-term outcomes for those survivors? I think it's an issue that people aren't looking closely enough at. to truly understand what helps them avoid re-victimization, and what kind of services not only do we think that they need, but what do they themselves, feel that they need? And then what are the outcomes of those services? I mean, simply because we've got so many people on the call, I really think that this is an important issue that deserves a lot more attention so that we can design programming that specifically, meets the needs of survivors coming out of these situations. And in terms of NGOs working in this space, maybe Erica could say more, but I'm sure we could provide a list of the contacts that we have. And I'm sure the Global Fund also has a list of NGOs that they're working with.
Yeah, I think we'd be happy to share that. We did a stakeholder mapping exercise at the beginning of this study because we want to target NGOs in this space. So we'd be happy to share a list of those organizations. And as Karim mentioned, GFEMS likely produced half of that list for us, so they have a lot of information as well. I would just say that the one kind of anecdotal qualitative finding from our study was that a lot of rehabilitation reintegration programs that include alternative livelihood programming, sometimes they're not sufficient because of the types of economic activities they're targeting. So, one stakeholder talked a lot about, training women to make and sell rice cakes. But doing that, being a street food vendor, is probably not going to give people enough of a livelihood to keep them out of the sex industry for good. So I think investing in alternative livelihood programming that has, promising long-term job prospects that would actually earn them more than what they could make in the sex industry is very important. And one of our stakeholders, of course, talked a lot about investing in entrepreneurship programs and connecting victims with marketing support, financing in the form of small business loans and things like that could be a potential way to address that issue.
And then just on top of that, let's not, ignore the importance of psychosocial support services as well for survivors, specifically child survivors that are coming out of a situation and may need other services. And again, there's no magic bullet, one intervention that's going to solve everything, but kind of understanding how all of these programs and interventions interact together towards positive outcomes, I think is extremely important.
Quick comment on that as well. I strongly agree with everything that Karim and Erica just said. And one of the things that has occurred to me as I've been kind of involved in the machine learning and artificial intelligence for humanitarian causes, kind of in that domain for several years now, is that primarily when we're dealing with issues like counter human trafficking, we see a lot of tech that's focused on detection and analysis and investigation. I've seen algorithms designed that can identify illicit brick kilns from geospatial imagery from satellites, for example, using machine learning, which is remarkable and certainly a good thing to have. But I've seen far less investment in ways that technology could potentially assist in scaling up rehabilitation and psychosocial support. And I think that's maybe a tremendous opportunity that's currently under-investigated in ways that, that all of these sort of technological innovations that we're seeing can potentially help these people who have gotten out of these difficult situations and need a lot of assistance to stay out of them in the future.
Thanks, Erica, Karim, and Sam. I'll just say that agree with what these guys said, and also GFEMS would be happy to continue this conversation further. We're running short on time. I just want to make sure. I saw a hand from Katrina Castillo. If you still have a question, we could do that as a last one before we close this session. If not, then we'll go ahead and conclude. So, Katrina, do you still want to ask your question?
Hey, it's Katrina from the U.S. Embassy. And no, I think the guys have answered my question. So thank you guys so much.
No problem. Well, thank you so much for attending. Once again, I want to thank all the participants that took the time to join us and learn a little bit more about this research. I also want to thank the presenters for taking the time to share such rich insights from their very different aspects of modern slavery research. I hope you all found the content of this webinar interesting and informative. We'll share the links to the publications associated with the presentations, along with a link to the webinar's recording for everybody's convenience. And on behalf of GFEMS and our partners, I invite everybody to reach out to us to continue our interactions informally anytime. For those of you that are based in India, we have Neha Bansal, who talked about some of GFEMS's activities in India early on today, our country lead. She would also be happy to engage in country. So that being said, thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Mihir. Just want to echo the thanks to the panelists and for presenting their excellent work, and for all the attendees who decided to spend an extra hour and a half of their evenings with us. I really appreciate it. We've got some good ideas that were shared here, and maybe some good ideas for additional webinars in the future. Kind of want to link the two communities together and share expertise across the web. As Mihir said, we'll try to get the links to the groups and copies of the slides, as well as the presentation. It may take a few days, but trust us, we'll figure it out, and we'll get you as soon as we can. So thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.